Hey, I'm Paul Dries Rosenwinkel. I am a fourth year MDiv student at Luther Seminary, and this is a part of my final project for my new Missional Ministries class. So last semester I did an independent study where I interviewed 8 church starters and I asked them a bunch of different questions and tried to garner the information in a way that could give me some lessons that I learned from them. So I came up with 9 lessons that I learned. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take 5 of those lessons, which I'll get into in later videos, and compare them with the information that I've learned in this class, specifically with the lessons from these 3 books. The first book is by Alan Roxburgh. It's Joining God, Remaking Church, and Changing the World. And in this book, Roxburgh goes over a lot of the community involvement part of being in a church and how churches have kind of divorced themselves from being in the community. One of his central calls within the book is that we are called to follow Jesus into the neighborhood and that God is already at work in the neighborhood. The second book I want to look at is Preaching as Testimony by Anna Carter Florence. And in this book, Florence looks at 3 women who were very good preachers, but who were not allowed to preach because of the time period, because of the church that they belonged to. And so she looks at the way that testimony, this kind of thing that was in between preaching and just being as a layperson, but women could testify in all 3 of these women's situations. And that testimony allowed them to speak to the truth that God was creating in their life. So the third book that I'm looking at is The Pentecost Paradigm by Jacqueline Lewis and John Junca. And they're both involved with Middle Collegiate Church, which is the oldest Protestant church within North America or the United States. I'm not sure which. But in this book, they look at a lot of practices that their church has done and that they found to be best practices and how those practices can apply to the broader church. So my goal with this is to combine the information that I've gained from my independent study and compare it to what these 3 books are saying and what these 5 authors are saying, and see what lessons come out of that. And I hope that I create something that's valuable for you.
Hey, I'm Paul. This is part 1 of a 5-part series about the lessons that I've learned from church starters and people involved in church starting. One of those key lessons that I learned that almost every church starter talked to me about is it's really important for the church starter or the church leader or the community member, whomever we're talking about in this situation, to know why they're doing what they're doing. From the research that I've done, it seems like leaders have 3 characteristics that are really important. They need to have charisma, determination, and they need to have self-awareness. And I want to focus on this last one of self-awareness. We kind of know what charisma is, we kind of know what determination is, but self-awareness is one of those things that is really underrated in leaders. And leaders who have self-awareness have a better understanding of where their weak points are. One of the people that I interviewed was Pastor Kelly, and Pastor Kelly said that we have to be very careful that we don't get caught up in our own Kool-Aid, so to say. That we don't start drinking our own Kool-Aid and start to think that the church is all about us. Because when we do that, we really start to ignore all of our own weak points, and we start to think that we can be these super powerful people that run everything on our own. And that's not the truth. Every single one of the church planners that I talked to, that I interviewed, had their own weaknesses, and the ones that were self-aware were able to deal with those weaknesses in a really positive and helpful way, rather than let them hamstring them. One of the things that Roxburgh says in this book is that defaults operate in the back of all of our minds, and defaults generally operate in the systems that we work in. And having self-awareness allows us to see those defaults. Maybe not all of them, maybe not all the time, but it allows us to get a better sense of what defaults we're operating with. Self-awareness is one of those critical things for a leader. Finally, Lewis and Junca tell us that the stories that we tell as leaders are incredibly important. Both the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell our community about ourselves. We need to know why we're doing what we're doing as church leaders, whether that's as a church starter, whether that's as somebody trying to revitalize a church, whether that's somebody just coming in as an associate who's just trying to keep positive momentum going. The stories that we tell, they're important. So that's the question that I have for you is, what kind of church leader are you, and why are you doing what you're doing?
Hey, I'm Paul, and this is part 2 of my 5-part series on lessons that I've learned from church starts and from church starters. Lesson 2 is listen to the surrounding community, and that's something that every single one of the church starters that I spoke to emphasized, because knowing your context is incredibly important. And Yahel Curry talked about this. He said, before you make a convert, you have to make a friend. And what he's getting at there is that before people trust you enough, they have to first become your friends.
So he went out when he was a church starter on the south side of Chicago. He went out and asked people like, hey, what time do you want a Bible study to be? What time would you want this worship service to be? What time could we do this activity? And what people came back at him saying is, actually, we don't really need a Bible study right now. What this community needs is to have its sewers fixed. And so Pastor Curry started working on community organizing. He started talking to people in the city government, and he got the sewers fixed, and that earned him a lot of trust within the community. One of the things that Pastor Tyler Sitt said is trust is the only currency that we have.
One of the things that Roxburgh says in this book is follow Jesus into the neighborhood and travel lightly. And what he means by that is not necessarily that we need to go do a ton of prayer walks, although those are super helpful. What he's saying is that we need to listen to our community, that God is already at work. That's one of the principles of this entire book, is that God is already at work in the neighborhood, and we have to do our work to catch up, and we have to do listening to the Holy Spirit and see, where is the Holy Spirit already at work in this community?
Florence in this book writes about a woman named Sarah Osborne, who is teaching slaves how to read and then begins Bible studies and then begins to preach. There were people knocking on her door asking, hey, can you teach us to read? You're a teacher. And she started teaching them to read, and then all of a sudden she had white slave owners knocking on her door asking her for stuff. Justly or unjustly, that's a separate conversation. But what she did was she listened to the people within her context, and that's something that's crucially important and that the church starts know really well, and I think established churches could do well to follow the example of. Go into the neighborhood, travel lightly. This requires us to listen, and honestly, it also sometimes requires letting our dreams die. We have these grandiose ideas of what should happen, but part of listening to the community and truly listening to the community means letting go of these ideas that we have. Tyler Sitt speaks about him wanting to create an eco-church, and then after talking with members of the community, he realized that the community members thought eco-church just sounded like an expensive toilet bowl cleaner. So like eco was not a prefix that they enjoyed, so Tyler Sitt had to abandon that whole idea in his head. But because he listened to the community, he didn't make that massive misstep when he started a new city. That's an important step for starting a church, but it's also something that's important for established churches to engage in. We need to listen to the surrounding community and see what God is already doing there and how we can serve God in that way.
Hey, I'm Paul. This is part 3 of a 5-part series that I'm doing on lessons I've learned from church starters. So lesson number 3 involves understanding the mission. The mission is one of the most important things of any church start. When I was doing my internship with a community called Jacob's Well, one of the things that we talked about a lot was our mission, which was weaving together people and God and their communities. During that internship, I served as a part of the marketing team, and we got a substantial financial gift, and we got to decide where do we want to put this financial gift. So one of the things that we did is we went back to the mission of the community, the mission of Jacob's Well. And the mission was weaving together people and God and community. And one of the big things that we saw that was in opposition to this mission was actually the name itself of the community. Jacob's Well is something that's really affiliated with the evangelical community, something that's really biblical, something that was really a big turnoff for a lot of the people that we were trying to reach out to. So we decided maybe we should change the name. Now for most communities, that's something that's a little bit drastic to ask. However, for the community of Jacob's Well, Pastor Greg had talked to them again and again and again about the importance of this idea of the mission of the community. And they realized that the name Jacob's Well didn't really serve the community anymore. So we got to change the name from Jacob's Well to Fabric, something that fits our community a lot better and fits the mission of our community a lot better. Here's the thing. Every church community and at every community period has some kind of mission statement. And Lewis and Janka state that vision becomes boss. And that is really the truth. If your vision isn't told, if your vision isn't made clear, then you don't know what is bossing your community around. And that's why understanding your mission is so crucially important. One of the points that Roxburgh makes in this book is that people and systems generally try and stay in control. They really like to limit who is controlling the vision for communities, who is controlling the mission for communities to a limited number of people, or it's people who are quote-unquote approved. And this is really harmful for communities because it doesn't allow you to hear the full perspective of everyone within the community. And also for those of us who are Christians, not listening to the Holy Spirit is incredibly detrimental to any church. So I want to hammer home this point, because this is something that was really important, not just in the books that I was reading, but also in all the interviews that I conducted with church starters. Mission is paramount. Vision is paramount. Understanding why your community exists is incredibly, incredibly important.
Hey, I'm Paul. This is part 4 of my 5-part series on lessons that I've learned from church starts. And lesson 4 that I learned is essentially have a great worship service. Now, that sounds super obvious, and it is, quite honestly. But it's something that each one of the churches that I looked at, if they did it really well, that was a key factor into their growth. And I want to break it down a little bit. I think there's 2 major factors when it comes to having a great worship service. The first is flow. And this idea of flow is how easy is it for a person who's a total stranger to come into the space and integrate into that space. So how easy is it for them to find the parking lot? How easy is it for them to find the front door? How easy is it for them to find a seat? How easy is it for them to open up the hymnal or look on the screen or whatever? Each one of those moments where they're disrupted, where they feel like they recognize that they're not a part of the space, that's a disruption of flow. And so you want it to be as easy as possible for those newcomers. They should be welcomed as they're coming in. The second part is energy level. And I noticed a lot of the mega churches that I went to, they do a really good job of maintaining energy level. They do a really good job of keeping it cohesive. So they'll start off here, and then they slowly build up and build up and build up, and then they have the sermon going and everyone's all fired up, and then they do an altar call. I went to a church called River Valley, and it's not a church that I would agree with theologically, I'll say. I probably wouldn't agree with them on a lot of stuff, but they did such a good job of managing flow and managing energy that I was really engaged in the service, even though I honestly didn't want to be. And when I'm saying this, I'm not saying that worship needs to be perfect. I'm not saying that it needs to all go off without a hitch, but what I'm saying is that there needs to be a passion behind it, that flow needs to be considered, and also energy level needs to be considered. In Preaching as Testimony, Florence talks about the need for preaching to convert. That's the goal of preaching, is to convert. And Florence writes that the first person that preaching should convert is the preacher. And what she's saying in that is that preachers need to be on fire. They need to love what they're saying. They need to believe it themselves. And all 3 of the women that Florence talks about in that book are really on fire with the Holy Spirit in a way. They're really engaged with what they have to say, and they fully believe that what they're doing is important. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side that we want to avoid is something that Florence writes about, and she calls them dead preachers walking. There's preachers who aren't really engaged with what they're doing, who are just kind of going through the motions, maybe reading through the lectionary texts and recycling sermons. They don't really believe what they're saying, and that is really an anathema to having a great worship. So the lessons are pretty simple. You need to manage your flow, you need to manage your energy level, and also the preacher needs to care about what they're preaching about. And if you're able to do all those 3 things well, you're on the path to get a great worship service.
Hey, I'm Paul. This is part 5 of a 5-part series that I'm doing on church starts and the lessons that I've learned from church starts and also from material that I've covered in New Missional Ministries. Lesson 5 is letting go of cultural artifacts, the importance of letting go of cultural artifacts. Pastor Kelly, one of the pastors that I interviewed, has this really good story about the first time that he went to seminary and how the worship professor taught him all the proper way to fold his hands while he was saying the prayer and said something along the lines of, well, it might not count if you're not doing it this right way. Or this is like clearly the right way to do it, and the Holy Spirit won't intercede unless you do it this way. And for Pastor Kelly, that really felt like a cultural artifact. In fact, it really turned him off from seminary and made him go into this period of life where he said, maybe seminary isn't for me. So it took him 10 years to recover from encountering that cultural artifact. And the reason I have these 3 books out here isn't necessarily to say that these are cultural artifacts. I think the hymnal, the works of Luther, and the Book of Concord, these are all good things. But we just have to ask, are they doing what we want them to do? That's something that every church needs to ask itself, whether you're a startup or whether you've been an established church for a really long time. Florence's book, Preaching as Testimony, is essentially a story of 3 women who are struggling to deal with the cultural artifacts that are carried by a lot of the men that are leading the churches in their day. This is a story of 3 women who aren't allowed to preach because men are holding on to this cultural artifact that women should not be in the pulpit. Roxborough writes that practices certainly have their place, but we have to be careful that the practices that we're engaging with don't squeeze out God in these conversations. He's specifically talking about council meetings in this instance, but I think that goes for the whole entirety of a church's tradition. We have to ask, what are some cultural artifacts that we're holding on to? And so that's the question that I have for you and for your churches is, what cultural artifacts do you have? What are those things that you have held on to for a really long time And you need to examine, you need to ask the question, is this something that is really worth holding on to? Is this really fulfilling the mission?